Okay, I want to thank everybody for joining us for today's webinar entitled Computer Systems Assurance, What You Need to Know Before the Transition. We're going to go through a quick presentation today, and before we get into it, I'll go through a couple of slides about who Astrix is, and then we're going to turn it over to our speaker for today. His name is Vamsi Dasaka, and it'll just be a few minutes until we can turn it over to him. So if you're just joining us, settle in, and we again encourage you to ask as many questions as you want. You can enter them in on the GoToWebinar panel, and we will answer questions when we get to the end. We can go to the next slide, please. So briefly, before we get into the content, I just want to take a moment and explain who Astrix is. If you haven't participated in any of our webinars to date, we welcome you. And we'll take a moment just to tell you a little bit about who we are. So we're a company who successfully delivers highly specialized services, process technology, as well as outsourced services to fundamentally transform how science-based businesses operate. We do this in an effort to improve scientific outcomes in the lives of people everywhere. A couple of quick statistics about us. We were established as a company in 1995. We're privately held today. We originated as the IT division of APBI, which is a life science research organization. Today we operate from 7 offices in the United States and beautiful Costa Rica, and our headquarters are in Red Bank, New Jersey. We're a market leader in dedicated digital transformation services and expert outsourced services for the scientific community. We help companies like Fortune 1000 life science enterprises, chemical and CPG, government research institutions, typically companies with large and fast-growing IT or outsourced compliance needs. These are typically the companies that we are engaging with and helping. And we bring a wide variety of solutions to bear. We go to the next slide, please. And the solutions that we bring are really meant to span the complete life cycle of scientific data systems. That means from the very beginning, we can help companies as they may be considering a digital transformation, moving to the cloud, etc. We can work through business process analysis and enterprise architecture to help understand what kind of tech stack they're going to need to bring their laboratory into the modern age of computing. Beyond that, we can go through and do laboratory quality management software selection services. So this is where we can actually go in with our experts who've got deep expertise in a wide variety of different solutions on the market, and we are vendor agnostic, can help select the right solutions based on what we may have discovered in the first 2 parts. We can help with development and implementation. We can help with computer systems validation when the systems are installed as a post-implementation service. We also offer 360 digital quality services. These are expert services that are meant to optimize quality operations while ensuring compliance. We also do on-demand specialized staffing. These could be specialized scientific or technical staffing. At the end of the day, we evaluate, implement, manage, and optimize your ecosystem to accelerate your digital transformation. With that, I'd like to take a moment and introduce our speaker. We can go to the next slide, please. Vamsi Dasaka is our Director of Digital Quality and Compliance here at Astrix. Solution-oriented senior life sciences pro with 20+ years of advisory experience. He's helped companies deliver compliance-focused business process improvement solutions, as well as quality and manufacturing systems implementations. He's done this on a global scale. Specialized in leadership, program project management, regulatory compliance, as well as technology solutions and business process design. And he brings experience in complex, large-scale global projects. So with that, Vamsi, I'll turn it over to you, and I'll pop back on at the end of the presentation, but everybody, you're in great hands.
All right, thank you so much, Kevin. Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining. We'll spend the next 30 to 40 minutes talking through a very interesting topic, something that has been in the works for quite a while, but hasn't seen, as they say, the light yet. But from what we are seeing in the industry and working with our clients, we are definitely making some major headway into this. And we do believe that this is where the industry is headed. And given our leverage of technology over the last 20 months, and obviously changing priorities and shift in focus in the way that we do business, this will become, in our opinion, a very, very pertinent aspect of how we attain and maintain compliance, especially in a GXP environment. So today, from the agenda perspective, we'll talk about what computer system assurance is all about, how did it come about, and how does it really differ from computerized system validation? We'll talk about the risk-based model and how CSA applies to it. And more importantly, we'll spend some time on why we should actually think of moving to CSA. What are the advantages that it's bringing? And also, based on initial pilots, initial research that we have had with our clients, we try and dig into who's looking to move and what their concerns are, right? To give you some of those lessons learned, so to speak, as you start looking into moving to CSA. And obviously talk through what that plan should look like and some of those methodologies and technologies that you should be considering as you start planning and initially moving into CSA. As Kevin mentioned, we want to make sure that we answer as many of your questions as possible. So if you could either use the chat box or type it in or hold your questions, we will definitely have some time towards the end for questions. So having said that, let's talk about how CSA came about in the first place. If the last 20 months or so have showed us anything, it's basically the digital transformation that is front and center, right? And the life sciences industry is nothing different. And as you start looking at applications and systems and quality management systems, there is now a need for an optimized regulatory and compliance approach to systems development and also their maintenance. I mean, given everything that has been happening across the globe and across the supply chain and value chains that GXP companies are working with. And all of this actually started way in 2011, where the FDA's case of quality was launched, right? So the FDA encouraged industry collaboration, innovation, automation, and digital technologies, and then was also working with industry leaders across the globe and across the FDA surveyed agent sites to identify best practices and also understand what was holding them back from actually going in and implementing something like this. Now, what led to this thinking in the first place? First and foremost was the current approach that validation was adopting. It was clearly not working. Validation was perceived as a barrier rather than a value add for new technology implementations. Many of you who've actually worked in the validation space, the thought will resonate where validation often comes in as an afterthought rather than being front and center of the project plan itself. And the only thing that people bring about when you bring in the term validation is, oh, you're going to go in and create all this documentation that I have to sign off on and have my team spend time on reviewing and updating, but there is no real value add to me. And that basically resulted in much longer timeframes and frameworks, and therefore the cost that is associated with implementation of the system, especially in a GXP environment. You cannot go live until you finish the validation. And more so than anything else, given the changes in technology, as we move into the cloud, we start implementing newer technologies like IoTs and machine learning and artificial intelligence, validation was not able to keep up. So, and it's not just the industry itself, right? I mean, there is always a handshake. The industry will only go as far as their risk appetite allows them to go to. And organizations were thus hesitant to invest in these highly automated technologies because there was one, no guidance, two, no precedence, and three, they were not clear on what they should be doing in terms of their validation approach to these technologies. And if you start looking at validation itself, we always say validation should be risk-based. But I think the challenge was now trying to identify the right risks and the desired level of validation effort that corresponds to those risks. Right? So basically spending time understanding what that system is doing, what is the intended use of the system, and where is that risk coming from, and how do you either control or mitigate that risk through technology, through business process modifications, optimizations, or whatever it might be, right? So the CSA for non-products, manufacturing, operations, and quality system software, that was the guidance that came out from the FDA. And it clearly focused on high-risk GXP elements while trying to simplify documentation and bringing in automation throughout the entire process. So how does CSA really differ from CSV as we know it, right? So CSV is very straightforward. It's documentation, the testing, and the critical thinking in that order, and also the effort that was required. CSA literally flips that around. It talks of critical thinking to be the maximum amount of time that you want to spend on. Then it starts talking about targeted testing, not just testing for the heck of testing, but more so targeted testing where you're actually going in and using different testing methodologies to make sure that you uncover direct and indirect risks around patient safety, product quality, and data integrity. What that does is it basically gives you a tailored risk management and testing approach. All these are basically tenets of what we now call quality by design. So CSA was bringing in the quality by design framework into our standard SDLCs. There's a term that is used which is called shift left. So you're basically moving from going in and doing a last step validation of your system and processes to actually going in and doing them along different steps of the process higher up, not towards the end. So from a CSA approach perspective, you're obviously focused on a lot of critical thinking, making sure that you analyze the risks objectively and you evaluate them. And you start leveraging testing across the board at different levels. While documentation will still remain important, it should therefore reduce the amount of time and effort that goes into generating and then maintaining that documentation as you start shifting into an objective, critical thinking, and evaluated response to the validation approach itself. So what this does is it basically goes in and brings up a risk-based assurance model that is a little different from what we've been used to, right? So you basically, for all of you who have worked on CSV before, if it's high risk, you had a specific set of testing that you would do, right? Boundary testing, challenge testing, what you might want to call it. And then that level of testing would go down. What CSA is now proposing is changing the type of testing itself. And that's what we mean by the assurance method. And that assurance method is driven by the impact of that risk that we define and identify. Right? So as you can see in the table, if it's a high risk to your process along those three parameters I mentioned above earlier, product quality, patient safety, and data integrity, you would then go into having some kind of a scripted testing approach. On the other hand, if the risk is low, right, so it's a business risk that is not as high as other risks that you might have, you'd basically go back and have some kind of ad hoc testing methodology built into your process. Now, what does that do? You are going in and focusing on the high risks and keeping your scripted testing limited to the high risk, while you're using unscripted and ad hoc testing methodologies for your medium and low risk items. Now, obviously, there is going to be a learning, right? You cannot shift today without actually going in and implementing some of these or even understanding what all of this is going to be. And that only happens through experimentation and making sure that you are going in and using some of your current projects as pilots. So for example, there is within testing itself, there is exploratory testing, there is automated testing, right? So when you start talking about testing methodologies that are different, you are now going to have to make sure that there are people, your team is trained, your system supported, and therefore your documentation can explain your approach. So for example, you start talking about exploratory testing. It's basically a technique used by the developers and testers to explore system behavior. And for this to be a success, you need to have good knowledge of the system itself. And to engage in this type of testing, you would need to make sure that it's not just a group of testers that you brought on, but somebody who actually understands the system and therefore the process the system is trying to implement. And same thing with automated testing. I mean, there is a lot of conversations that we've had about, oh, we can go in and automate this test script. It's not as simple as going in and putting an automation along the test script. It is more important to understand, one, is this something that is repetitive, right? Is this something that is going to be performed multiple times across the life cycle of the system? That is where automation makes the most sense. Second, can we actually do this across multiple environments? Can we do it in our dev box? Can we do it on the quality side? And that is where, through the change of configurations, we are able to go in and use automated tests to our advantage. And finally, there has to be very detailed instructions and evidences that we can use as objective evidence in the quality environment. So will this automated testing provide that? So those are some of those nuances that you would need to consider as you start looking at what assurance model and therefore testing methodology that you would want to use. So having made the decision to actually move, why move and what's the advantage? As we spoke about, one, there is always going to be a reduction in the execution time from a test script perspective. So if I have reduced the amount of scripted testing that I am going to do based on other testing methodologies that I have incorporated into my SDLC earlier on, I am now reducing the amount of time I take in both timeline and effort when I do my actual testing, the scripted testing, which will therefore drive a faster implementation. If I'm going in and targeting a 90% or higher reduction in test script and tester errors, at least a 50% decrease in my validation time. That's what we are projecting. Now, all of this is not we as in we, but the industry, the MDIC Case for Quality Forum that was held December 2020. These were some of the findings based on pilots that some of the organizations had and shared data across the board. Now, if you have an impact on your timelines and your amount of effort, there's obviously going to be a direct impact on your total project cost. You will reduce your number of defects, and therefore you'll also spend less time trying to fix and write up deviations and as such for some of those aspects that we talked about. And what does this do to the people? Obviously, their morale is higher. Their productivity is higher. The quality at the end of the day is higher because you now have lesser deviations, lesser issues that you will deal with, and therefore people are happy. But fundamentally, what is changing is, as we mentioned, the critical thinking aspect of it, right? They're spending more time trying to think through some of the scenarios, some of the risks, rather than just generate documentation for the sake of document generation, which basically would result in better software quality and therefore much better patient safety and data integrity across the board. Because they are now spending more time trying to think through what some of those scenarios are rather than generating a lot of documentation. Now, obviously, this is not something that will happen in one day or even 1 week. It will take time, right? There are a lot of cases where people have dived into this approach and failed because they didn't have a plan. They did not know what they would need to do at any given point of time if they were to hit a roadblock or a challenge. So what is critical is making sure that you have a well laid out plan. And more than the plan, the commitment, both from the leadership as well as throughout the organization. So when we start looking at some polling that was conducted by the APR, the American Pharmaceutical Review, in January of 2021, the question was asked, when will you start implementing CSA? Now, please keep in mind, these numbers would have changed given the fact that people are still getting back to the new way of working now, given everything that we've had with the pandemic. But wanted to present this more as a directional view towards the sentiments of what the industry was thinking. So 46% wanted to immediately do it. It's straightforward. Why? Because they want to realize savings in terms of cost, in terms of their resource utilization, and therefore timelines. 47% said they're not sure when they will start. Maybe they were not clear on what CSA is all about, what is the value add that CSA is bringing to them. And 7% had no plans at all. Maybe they were still trying to figure it out. So if we take that one question and say, if you're unsure, what is preventing you from adopting CSA? And this is where it brought out the whole conversation that we've just had. 40% need help implementing. What does that mean? Basically, they're not clear on what they would need to do. What do I need to do to my SDLC? What do I need to do to my QMS? What do I need to do to my testing methodologies? How do I go in and implement automation in my testing approach? What savings can I show as an ROI for the investments that I will make to make sure CSA is brought in? So they need help. 33% were waiting for others, and apologies for the typo, but 33% are waiting for others to see what they can learn from certain pilots or use cases. And 27% were actually facing internal resistance. What does that tell you? There are people who are obviously going to be resistant to change, but they do not recognize the value add that CSA brings, and therefore they're resisting the change. right? So how do we get across this, right? How do we make sure that we start building the road towards CSA? The first thing is to develop a plan. And what does that plan give us, right? As I mentioned earlier, it cannot be done on huge projects. Start with something small, experiment using pilots. I would not start saying, I'm going to implement CSA on my ERP implementation project. I don't think that's going to be a great idea. I would start with something small, use it as a pilot to learn what are the areas that are impacted, who are the resources that would need to understand what we're trying to do. And make sure that the resources across the board, leadership through the floor, understand and embrace that change. Change management at the resourcing level is going to be critical, because you also need to understand, one, who it is that is going to be performing some of those activities we talked about. Two, who is it going to impact? And what is their reaction and response going to be? What are they going to be doing? So evaluate the current environment and processes. Leverage metrics to understand the current environment. So start talking to people, looking at your processes, looking at products, and then the projects that you have. And that's why I said, start using a pilot to drive this. And then you start building a plan to transition. You're not going to cross the bridge in a day. It's going to take a while, but make that journey something rewarding rather than the destination itself. And start focusing on vendor audits, because a huge aspect of CSA is basically moving some of the risk that we inherently assume as organizations, is moving that to the vendor, given where the software landscape is today. There were times where you would have an on-premise installation, and therefore you had to be responsible from a hardware, from a network, from everything else. Today, on a cloud-based environment, you're not going to be responsible. You don't even have visibility sometimes. But then your vendor takes on that responsibility based on SLAs that they sign with you. So make sure that those vendors are audited. Make sure that you take that into consideration as you start moving left, shifting left. And finally, I think, make sure that your strategy and execution are in sync. And what we mean by that is be nimble enough and agile enough to be able to update your strategy based on what you're seeing through execution. It's not set in stone, right? This is a new area that we'll have to go into, but have the ability to make these updates on a frequent basis till you get to a good baseline. And use digitization and automation to the advantage that you have. Right. So as you start looking at every single aspect of CSA, right? One, there are areas that you would need to focus on brand new, and two, there are areas that you might need to enhance that already exist within your organization. So let's talk through some of the areas that you might need to focus on brand new. One, we mentioned critical thinking. Make sure that your people are trained and there is the assurance rigor that is, imparted to your team members. And you have a strategy to build and monitor controls for a sustained validation across the board. So that's your critical thinking. Think through those scenarios, think through those use cases. The other aspect I just mentioned is becoming agile, right? Use agile to your advantage. Use the agile methodology to your advantage. have people trained in Scrum, in implementation of Agile, and there's a term that we've used called test-driven development, where you're actually going in and changing the way you develop certain aspects of the system through going in and making sure that they're testing it in a different way rather than the standard test methodology that they're used to. And we also talked about introducing early testing techniques into your process. We talked about ad hoc testing, unscripted testing. So make sure that that in itself is there. It's built into your process. And as you do that, you then start getting more and more agile and nimble, and therefore are able to change much easily. And finally, bring in the right subject matter expertise. We've mentioned a couple of times using use cases and scenarios to drive the quality of the system or the product. You will not be able to think through a lot of these use cases and scenarios unless you have the right expertise in the room. You need to make sure that there are subject matter experts who understand the process as well as the system, so that you are now driving down some of the testing that you would have because you have built it into your use cases and strategy. The other aspect that I mentioned is there are areas that you might need to focus on enhancing that you might already have. So for example, we talked about upskilling and reskilling some of your resources, right? Get them trained on Agile, get them trained on use cases, get them trained on technology, competencies that are going to be critical to the business that you're serving. Leverage supplier documentation. That is something else that you would need to have. And the last thing is go in and relook at your risk-based testing. We touched upon that earlier. Risk-based testing is going to be critical to making sure that we understand where we want to focus our efforts, and also try and make sure that we reduce the time and effort it takes for us to complete the quote-unquote CSV aspect of any implementation. So let's talk through some of those technologies and methodologies, right? We talked about Agile. We talked about behavioral driven development and early testing techniques. But from an automation and digital technology perspective, there are new frameworks and methodologies. For example, continuous integration, where you're going in and you're not limiting yourself to a certain set of features on releases and things like that, but you're continuously integrating, continuously developing. It's CI/CD. And as you're doing this, you are now able to go in and employ automated controls across the board. You're now able to go in and say, I can use this automation at various instances and various environments to give me results in a much faster time frame, and that I can really use to drive the speed of implementation. And finally, start looking at quality management system tools. The one thing that a lot of the pilots that we were involved in learned very quickly is if there is a lack of integration between your existing QMS and your SDLC, when you start making changes to either of them, it's going to be a nightmare to keep track of them. Your SDLC might get changed, but if your QMS does not reflect that change, it's going to be a nightmare. So make sure that your quality management framework, your quality management processes reflect the changes you're making to your SDLC. And use tools that are integrated across the enterprise, right? I mean, we've all been in situations where we've had to go in and post documentation at different locations and lose track of it. Make sure that there is an integrated doc management system for starters, that you don't have to go in and look and spend time looking for all the time. And also make sure that as you start bringing in tools to manage your SDLC, your requirements, your testing, your change controls, there is a way to integrate and leverage that data across the board, because that gives you very powerful metrics to show how you are doing, where your challenges are, whether it be in a particular area, whether it be in a particular region, whether it be in a particular functionality. You're able to get all of that data, and the more data that you have, the better you are at making decisions that impact your overall implementation. So having said that, I think we'll take a pause and see if there's any questions. And I'm happy to answer anything or any thoughts that you might have. Like I said, you could use the questions in the webinar, and if otherwise, we'll make sure we get them to you.
Vance, do you think you can go to the next slide, actually? And a couple things here. The folks that are on, if you don't know how, there's a question panel on the bottom right-hand side of the GoToWebinar panel. You can type a question in there. We won't read your question out loud. We won't read your name, and we won't read your company. But do have a couple of questions here. Bear with me 1 second, please. I'm going to do my best, but this is a very, very long question. So let me see if I can break this into pieces. As GSP applications evolve more and more and are mirroring best practices from software design industries, how are change management systems such as GIT Hub, GitHub being looked at as they track automated software very efficiently and allow for frequent system pushes? I'll stop there and see if you want to tackle the first part of that question.
Sure. Thank you, Kevin. So the one good thing about all of these applications is they understand that the life sciences sector is very regulated, and they're building in controls and process methodologies into their application to cater to those regulations, right? So for example, when you start looking at applications like GitHub and software releases and things like that, there are ways to configure those applications to give you the controls that you need, and make sure that those controls tie into your overall process, and use that to your advantage, right? You should be able to go in and link GitHub to Jira, where you're saying, this is my release, this is my change, therefore this is where I have the ability to track all my changes, and I don't have to go in and create 25 different documentations to show that change. It's linked through and through. So hopefully that answers the question.
Great. Okay, let me see here. What about what deliverables differ between a CSV and a CSA?
A great question. In my mind, that is driven completely by your current SDLC. There might be certain deliverables that you currently have in your SDLC, for example, design specifications. There might be other documentation that you might have, which might become redundant, right? Why would I worry about design specifications? if I'm using a cloud-based system and I'm not going in and looking at every single thing that I'm developing. I'm not developing it. The second thing, obviously, is your risk approach or your risk analysis or risk assessment. You are now changing the thinking on risk. You're now going in and saying, okay, I'm looking at risk at different angles, using different filters, and each of those risk criteria will result not just in the type of risk or the type of controls that I have, but also determine the amount and the testing methodology that I'm going to employ. Therefore, my testing protocols might change. My test scripts might change. My validation approach might change. So to answer the question, when you start going through your SDLC, anything from your validation plan all the way to risk assessment specifications to your release and report, everything is potential to change based on how much you want to change it to, and what level of risk you're willing to accept, and how you're going to mitigate some of those risks.
Okay, great. Let me see here. I'm just kind of filtering through. I think we'll try to tackle maybe one more here. What is the estimated timeline for CSA implementation?
So from a agency perspective, we're still with the guidance. There is nothing in terms of a regulation that has come out, and it will take time. As I said, the last 20 months have put a break on some of these initiatives for obvious reasons. But companies are still pushing. Companies still want to make sure that they're getting the maximum value from the time and the dollars and that they spend on validation. And they are very much open to going in and implementing CSA versus CSV. Right now, the guidance itself, while it's still in draft format, what the agency is now looking for is some of those use cases and results from some of that use cases to be able to go in and finalize and formalize the guidance and maybe potentially make that into a regulation. So in my mind, we're looking at least about 12 to 18 months out before something comes up. But that doesn't mean that we don't actually start planning and implementing those pilot projects, because the one thing that we've learned with the agency is they move only as fast as the industry wants them to move. If there is a compelling reason why, and that's what we're talking to our clients about, is make sure that you talk to the agency, make sure that you show them what you have done from a pilot perspective, because that is the data point that they will need to make their decision. So the answer is 12 to 18 months in my mind.
Great. Okay, well, I think in the interest of time, we're going to go ahead and get some things wrapped up. There's a couple things I do want to mention to folks in the chat. If you look into the chat right now, you will see there's a link to a white paper in there. It's a white paper that we wrote, transitioning from CSV to CSA. So you could pull that down from the website, and I'd certainly encourage you to do that. I'll leave that up there for a minute. Again, go into the chat. You'll see it's in there. All you got to do is just click on the link, and then I'll drop you right out into the website where you can access and download that paper. So we'd obviously encourage you to do that. There'll be some more detail in there. If you have direct questions of us or Astrix and you'd like to potentially engage with our team, I would direct you to the email address that you see up on the screen right now, M. Zakowski, that's Michael Zakowski, M. Zakowski at Astrix Inc. And you can also always just drop right into the website and hit a contact form as well, and that'll get you to the right folks. You know, I think, again, we'll wrap up with a couple of other kind of quick items here. We'll go ahead and get